Most people think calm comes after life finally settles down, after the noise fades and the worries behave. But what if calm doesn't wait for any of that? What if it's been quietly sitting inside you, even in the middle of your most restless moments, just beyond the reach of a single steady breath? There was once someone who believed peace had abandoned him for good, only to discover it had never learned how to leave. His story begins the way many do, with a chest that tightens for no clear reason and a mind that drifts too far from home. Anxiety has a peculiar way of making the familiar feel distant, as though you're watching your own life through slightly fogged glass. You might smile, speak, carry on, while inside something quietly pleads for ground that doesn't shift. It can feel frightening, even lonely, especially when no one else seems to notice the invisible storm. Yet there's a small, almost overlooked doorway hidden in the body itself, one that doesn't require strength or certainty to open. All it asks is that you pause long enough to remember it exists. This story isn't about defeating anxiety or forcing yourself into bravery. It's about a gentler discovery that the path back to yourself may be closer than your next thought. In fact, it may be closer than your next step. There's a quiet rhythm inside you that knows the way, even when everything else feels scrambled. The person you're about to meet stumbled upon it by accident, though perhaps nothing about it was accidental at all. If you've ever felt tired of fighting your own mind, tired of pretending you're fine when you're not, you may recognize something of yourself here. Not in dramatic gestures, but in small moments. A crowded room, a sudden wave of unease, the wish to simply feel normal again. This is a story for those moments, for the parts of you that haven't given up even when hope feels thin. And it begins with something so simple most people overlook it entirely. So before we go any further, there's a quiet question worth holding on to. What if the way back to yourself has been with you all along, waiting patiently for you to notice? The answer doesn't arrive all at once, and it doesn't demand anything you don't already have. It unfolds slowly, like breath on a cold morning, visible only when you stop rushing past it. And once seen, it's difficult to forget. The first time it happened, it felt as if the air had quietly left the room without telling him. One moment he was standing in line at a small bakery. The next his chest tightened like a drawstring pulled by unseen hands. He tried to inhale, but the breath came in thin, like sipping through a cracked straw. Sounds dulled, colors flattened, and even his own thoughts seemed to step a few paces away from him. He wondered, not for the first time, how a body could feel both heavy and hollow at once. He stepped outside, hoping the open sky might loosen whatever had cinched shut inside him. Instead, the pavement tilted slightly, as if the world had grown unsure of its footing too. People passed by, ordinary and unbothered, carrying bags and conversations and the kind of ease he could barely remember. He pressed a hand to his chest, half expecting to find something tangled there, like knotted cords behind a wall. If calm had once lived in him, it now felt like a tenant who'd slipped away in the night. There was a small object in his coat pocket he carried without thinking, a tiny wooden whistle that no longer made a clear sound. Years ago it had sung bright, steady notes. Now it produced only a strained breath, thin and wavering. He turned it in his fingers as he leaned against the cool brick of the bakery wall. Somehow, the useless whistle felt honest, as if it understood the effort of trying to call out and hearing only a fragile whisper in return. He didn't know why he kept it, only that letting it go felt harder than it should. A quiet panic crept in then, the kind that didn't shout but pressed steadily, like water rising behind a door. What if this was how it would be now? Breath shallow, thoughts distant, the world slightly out of reach. He watched a mother kneel to tie her child's shoe, so calm, so present, as if nothing could pull her away from that small moment. He tried to remember when simple things had stopped feeling simple. Even the air, once unnoticed, had become something he chased and never quite caught. He closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to feel the faint movement of air against his upper lip. In, then out, uneven but still there, like a hesitant knock on a familiar door. A quiet thought surfaced, almost shy. What if the way back wasn't through force, but through something softer he'd overlooked? He slipped the whistle back into his pocket, fingers lingering as if it might warm in his hand. And somewhere between one unsteady breath and the next, the question began to take shape. In the days that followed, he began to notice something he'd long ignored, as if a quiet rhythm had been playing beneath the noise all along. Even when anxiety surged without warning, his breath kept moving, stubborn and faithful, like a tide that refused to abandon the shore. He started to wonder if it wasn't the enemy he'd believed it to be, but a thin thread leading back to himself. The thought felt almost too simple, which made him distrust it at first. Still, he found his hand drifting to his chest now and then, just to feel the rise and fall. One evening, sitting by a fogged window, he took the wooden whistle from his pocket and held it to his lips. He didn't try to force a sound this time. He simply breathed through it, slow and tentative. The whistle answered with a faint, steadier note than before, fragile but clear enough to surprise him. It wasn't music exactly, but it wasn't strain either, more like a voice remembering how to speak. He lowered it, blinking, unsure why such a small change felt like a door cracking open. He began experimenting in quiet moments, breathing in as if he were filling an empty cup, then letting the air leave without rushing it out. At first, his shoulders protested, accustomed to bracing against invisible storms. But gradually, something softened, the way tight fists loosen when they realize there's nothing left to hold. Calm didn't arrive dramatically. It seeped in around the edges, modest and almost apologetic. He noticed he could sit a little longer without scanning for escape routes. It occurred to him that maybe calm wasn't something to chase across distant horizons. Maybe it lived closer, tucked into the body's quiet mechanics, waiting to be noticed again. The idea felt strangely comforting, like discovering a forgotten key in an old coat pocket. He still didn't trust it completely. Anxiety had a way of returning just when hope grew careless. Yet each slow breath seemed to whisper that the way back might be less of a battle and more of a remembering. He turned the whistle over in his hands, tracing the worn edges with his thumb. If breath could coax even this small piece of wood back into voice, what else might it restore in him? The question lingered as the room dimmed into evening, neither urgent nor dismissible. Somewhere deep inside, a cautious curiosity began to stir, the kind that doesn't demand answers right away. And without quite deciding to, he found himself wondering who might understand this fragile discovery. Little by little, his world had shrunk to the size of what felt safe, which wasn't very large at all. Invitations went unanswered, calls silenced, even casual conversations trimmed down to polite nods and quick exits. He used to be the one who lingered, who laughed too long at small jokes, who didn't measure every outing like a risk. Now he studied rooms the way sailors study weather, scanning for signs of storms no one else seemed to see. It was exhausting, this constant bracing against moments that hadn't even happened yet. At the grocery store, he avoided the longer aisles, choosing the ones closest to the exit just in case. When a stranger spoke too abruptly, his chest tightened before his mind could form a reply. He smiled anyway, the practiced kind that reassured others while leaving him strangely absent from his own face. Later, he'd replay the exchange, wondering when simple interactions had started to feel like narrow bridges over deep water. The wooden whistle pressed faintly against his coat as he walked, a small reminder of something he couldn't quite name. He missed the person he used to be in quiet, private ways, the way one misses an old song that no longer plays on the radio. There had been a time when he trusted his body, when breath arrived without supervision and the world didn't tilt without warning. Sometimes he caught glimpses of that former self in reflections, a posture, a flicker of curiosity, before anxiety stepped in like an uninvited editor. Grief settled in then, not loud or dramatic, just a dull ache of recognition. Losing confidence, he realized, felt less like a fall and more like a slow fading. One afternoon, he sat on a park bench pretending to watch pigeons argue over crumbs. In truth, he was calculating how far he was from home, how quickly he could leave if the familiar wave rose again. A group nearby burst into laughter, bright and careless, and he felt both drawn to it and shut out by invisible glass. He took out the whistle, turning it between his fingers as if it were a compass that had forgotten north. For a moment, he considered tossing it into the bushes, just to stop carrying the weight of it. Instead, he held it loosely in his palm and focused on a single breath, the way he'd practiced by the fogged window. In, then out. Not perfect, but steadier than before, like someone learning to walk again on uncertain legs. The pigeons settled, the laughter drifted away, and the bench beneath him felt a little more solid. He didn't notice the older man at the far end of the bench watching him with quiet, unintrusive attention, but that presence, calm as still water, had already begun to lean gently into his story. The older man didn't speak right away, which somehow made his presence easier to bear. He simply sat there feeding small crumbs to the pigeons, unhurried, as if time moved differently around him. After a while, his gaze drifted to the object in the younger man's hand. "That whistle's tired," he said gently, not as a judgment, but as one might comment on the weather. The younger man let out a faint, surprised breath, as if someone had just named something he hadn't known was visible. He turned the whistle over, suddenly aware of its worn surface and the shallow dents along its side. "It used to sound clear," he admitted, his voice catching on the last word. The man nodded, eyes soft, as though he could hear echoes of those lost notes without needing proof. "Wood dries when it's kept too close to heat," he murmured, "and sometimes it forgets how to carry air." The explanation felt less like a fact and more like a mirror held at a careful angle. Curious despite himself, the younger man lifted the whistle and blew, producing that same thin, strained sound. It trembled in the air like a fragile thread, then dissolved into nothing. He felt a flicker of embarrassment, as if the object had exposed something private. The older man only tilted his head, listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for important music. "Still," he said after a moment, "it hasn't given up entirely." The whistle began to feel heavier in the younger man's palm, not in weight, but in meaning. Its narrow passage seemed suddenly symbolic of his own chest, tight and reluctant to open. He imagined air traveling through both of them, meeting resistance, losing strength along the way. For the first time, he wondered if he had been carrying it not out of habit, but because it understood something about him no one else did. The realization was oddly comforting, like discovering a companion in an unexpected place. A breeze moved through the park then, stirring the leaves into a soft, restless whisper. The older man brushed crumbs from his hands and stood, pausing as if deciding whether to speak again. "Sometimes objects remember what we forget," he said quietly, eyes kind but unreadable. Then he stepped onto the path, walking at a pace that invited neither pursuit nor distance. The younger man watched him go, the whistle warm now in his grasp, sensing that something unspoken had just begun. The next afternoon, as if drawn by a quiet thread he couldn't see, the younger man returned to the same bench. He told himself it was for the open air, for the pigeons, for anything ordinary enough not to raise suspicion, yet part of him hoped, cautiously, almost shyly, that the older man might appear again. When he did, settling onto the bench with the same unhurried grace, it felt less like coincidence and more like a page turning. Neither of them spoke at first, which made the silence feel surprisingly kind. After a while, the older man glanced over, not at his face, but at the subtle lift and fall of his shoulders. "You're working too hard just to breathe," he said softly, as though commenting on a heavy bag someone had forgotten they were carrying. The younger man gave a small, self-conscious laugh, the kind people use when they don't know whether to agree or deflect. No one had ever pointed it out so plainly, and yet it didn't feel intrusive. If anything, it felt like someone noticing a bruise he'd been pretending wasn't there. The older man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, polished stone, smooth as river glass. He rolled it between his fingers with slow familiarity, then held it out for the younger man to see. "The body remembers calm," he said, his voice low and steady, "even when the mind tells stories about danger." The words settled gently, like dust in sunlight, not demanding belief, but inviting it. The younger man watched the stone move, noticing how the man's breath seemed to guide the rhythm without effort. Without quite thinking, he lifted the wooden whistle, as if placing his own object into the conversation. The older man studied it with a quiet warmth that felt strangely reassuring. "Ah," he murmured, "you've been carrying your breath outside yourself." There was no hint of criticism, only recognition, as if he'd just named an old habit everyone secretly shared. The younger man felt something in his chest loosen, a knot easing not because it was forced, but because it had been seen. They sat there together, two strangers linked by small objects and the invisible currents between breaths. Around them the park moved in its gentle, ordinary way, footsteps on gravel, distant laughter, the rustle of wings. The younger man realized he wasn't scanning for escape routes anymore, not in that moment. Instead, he found himself quietly attentive, curious about what this calm presence might reveal next. And as the older man drew a slow breath that seemed to steady the very air around them, the younger man leaned in without realizing it. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for You. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The older man didn't announce the lesson as if it were something rare or fragile. He simply placed the smooth stone in the younger man's palm and gently closed his fingers around it. "Let the breath do what it already knows," he said, his tone so natural it almost sounded like a reminder rather than instruction. The younger man nodded, unsure what to expect, half waiting for something complicated. Instead, the man inhaled slowly, visibly, like someone demonstrating how to sip warm tea without burning the tongue. "Not deep," he added softly, noticing the younger man's instinct to gulp air. "Just slow, as if you're persuading the air to stay a little longer." They breathed together, the park sounds fading into a quiet backdrop. The whistle rested against the younger man's chest, and for once, it didn't feel like a burden, more like a companion listening in. When he exhaled, the air left in a long, unhurried stream, and something inside him softened, the way a clenched jaw releases when it realizes it's safe. They repeated the pattern, in a small pause, then out, until the rhythm began to feel less like an exercise and more like a memory returning. The older man tapped lightly on the whistle. "Each breath passes through you the way air passes through this," he said. "If you rush it, the sound strains. If you guide it gently, it remembers its voice." The younger man lifted the whistle and breathed through it, producing a tone that wavered at first, then steadied into something unexpectedly clear. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a cautious smile that seemed to belong to an earlier version of himself. "It's not magic," the older man said with a hint of warmth, as if anticipating the thought. "Fear tightens, patience loosens. Breath is simply the bridge between the two." The words settled in without resistance, not as a rule, but as something he could test whenever the world tilted again. For the first time, anxiety felt less like a monster and more like a knot, with an edge he could gently work free. They sat quietly afterward, the lesson lingering in the air like the last note of a song. The younger man noticed the ground beneath his feet, the weight of the whistle in his hand, the steady rhythm in his chest. None of it was dramatic, and maybe that was the point. Change, he realized, might arrive in small, almost forgettable moments that only reveal their meaning later. As he looked up, ready to ask something he couldn't quite name, he sensed the real work was only beginning. In the days that followed, he didn't try to conquer the anxiety all at once, which would have been his old way. Instead, he practiced in the smallest moments, like while waiting for water to boil or standing at a crosswalk with strangers. When the familiar tightness crept in, he placed a hand lightly over the whistle in his pocket and slowed his breath just a little. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to remind his body of that quiet bridge. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but even the trying felt different now. There were setbacks, of course, the kind that arrived on ordinary afternoons without explanation. Once a sharp remark from a coworker sent his chest into that old spiral, the room narrowing as if seen through the wrong end of a telescope. He stepped outside, embarrassed by how quickly calm had slipped through his fingers. For a minute he considered giving up, telling himself nothing had really changed. Then he remembered the stone, the bench, the patient rhythm, and tried again. In, pause, out, like relearning a language he'd nearly forgotten. To his surprise, the wave receded sooner than before, not disappearing but loosening its grip. He noticed details returning first: the smell of rain on warm pavement, the distant hum of traffic, the simple weight of his shoes against the ground. It felt like stepping back into his own outline after drifting just beyond it. He even let out a small private chuckle at how stubborn anxiety could be, like a cat that insisted on sitting exactly where it wasn't wanted. Humor, faint but genuine, flickered back into spaces that had felt sealed shut. He began to trust these small recoveries, the way one trusts a path that gradually becomes familiar underfoot. Each time he returned to his breath, the distance back to himself seemed shorter. The whistle, once a symbol of strain, started to feel like a quiet ally, its clear note easier to summon when he needed proof. He didn't tell anyone about these tiny victories. They felt too delicate for casual conversation. But inside, something steadier was taking root, patient as a tree growing where no one thought it could. One evening, he found himself lingering at the park again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The bench, the pigeons, the rustling leaves, all of it felt less like a test and more like a place he could simply be. He wondered if the older man would appear, half hoping, half content if he didn't. As he breathed in the cooling air, He sensed that the next challenge wouldn't come in quiet solitude, but somewhere louder, less forgiving, and for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he would run from it. The real test arrived on a crowded bus one gray morning, the kind where the air felt already used before it reached his lungs. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, conversations overlapping, the driver braking a little too sharply at every light. He felt the first flicker of panic spark in his chest, quick and familiar, like a match struck in the dark. For a split second, his old instinct urged him to get off at the next stop, no matter where it was. Instead, his fingers found the whistle in his pocket, grounding him like a small anchor. He shifted his weight, planting his feet more firmly as the bus lurched forward again. In a quiet, careful inhale that didn't try to prove anything. A brief pause, as if letting the moment catch up with him. Then out, slow enough to feel his shoulders ease, even with a stranger's bag brushing his arm. The panic didn't vanish, but it stopped swelling, held at the edges by that steady rhythm. A child near the window laughed at something only he could see, bright and unguarded. The sound cut through the fog in the younger man's mind, reminding him that life was still unfolding around him, not just inside him. He focused on the sensation of air moving past his lips, the simple mechanics he'd once overlooked. With each breath, the bus felt less like a trap and more like a temporary place between where he'd been and where he was going. He even noticed the faint scent of someone's citrus soap, oddly reassuring in its ordinariness. By the time his stop approached, his pulse had settled into something almost calm. He stepped onto the pavement with a quiet disbelief, as though he'd crossed an invisible border without realizing it. The city noise didn't rush at him the way it used to. It hummed at a manageable distance. He slipped the whistle from his pocket and held it for a moment, not out of desperation this time, but gratitude. Confidence, he realized, didn't return in a grand announcement. It slipped back in quietly when given room. As he walked down the familiar street, he caught himself lifting his head instead of scanning for exits. Shop windows reflected a posture that looked more like the person he remembered being. He knew there would be harder days ahead, moments when breathing alone might feel insufficient. But now there was a pause between fear and flight, a space wide enough for choice. And somewhere in that space, a quiet freedom began to stretch its limbs. Some evenings he sat by the open window of his apartment, watching the light fade from gold to a softer gray. It had become a small ritual, nothing formal, just a pause before the night carried him elsewhere. He would place the wooden whistle on the table in front of him, not as a tool, but as a reminder. Then he'd rest his hands loosely in his lap and let his shoulders drop, as if setting down a bag he'd forgotten he was carrying. The first breath always felt uncertain, like stepping into cool water. He began to count gently in his mind, not in strict numbers, just a quiet rhythm. Inhale, long enough to feel the ribs widen slightly. Hold for a brief heartbeat, then exhale as if fogging a window. Sometimes his thoughts wandered off mid-breath, chasing old worries or replaying awkward moments from the day. When he noticed, he simply returned, the way one guides a distracted child back to the path without scolding. Each cycle smoothed the edges of his restlessness, almost imperceptibly. On harder nights when anxiety hovered like a storm that refused to break, he added one small gesture. He'd lift the whistle and breathe through it once, letting the thin note fill the room. The sound no longer strained. It trembled softly like a candle refusing to go out. Hearing it reminded him that air was moving, that he was still here, still capable of returning. He sometimes imagined the breath carrying away a single worry with each exhale, as if releasing a paper boat into a slow river. He didn't aim for perfection, only presence, which felt like a quieter kind of victory. Even a minute or two could shift something subtle inside, the way opening a window changes the feel of a room. Occasionally, he'd jot down one sentence in a notebook afterward. Not analysis, just a small observation like, "Tonight felt a little easier." Over time, the pages filled with these modest notes, proof that change had been happening in increments too small to notice day by day. Reading them back felt like listening to a distant echo of hope. One night, as he finished the ritual and reached to close the window, he realized the whistle hadn't left his pocket all day. He hadn't needed to check for it, hadn't clutched it in crowded places or quiet ones. The absence of urgency felt unfamiliar, almost tender. He held it up to the fading light, wondering when it had stopped being a lifeline and started becoming something else entirely. And that quiet realization lingered with him as the room settled into darkness. Weeks later, he returned to the park bench on a morning so still it felt as if the day itself were holding its breath. The pigeons strutted with quiet confidence, and the trees cast slow, patient shadows across the path. He sat down, noticing how the air moved easily in and out of his chest now, like a door that no longer stuck. The whistle rested in his palm, lighter than he remembered, its worn edges familiar in a different way. For a while, he simply listened to the gentle rhythm inside him, needing nothing else. He thought about all the moments he had spent searching for calm, as if it were hidden somewhere far away. Yet it had been there all along, tucked into the simplest act his body performed without permission or praise. Breath, he realized, was less like a tool and more like a quiet companion who had never left his side. Even in his worst spirals, it had waited patiently for him to notice again. The understanding didn't arrive as a revelation, just a soft settling of truth. A faint memory of the older man crossed his mind, though he hadn't seen him in days. He wondered if mentors sometimes stepped in only long enough to point toward a door we must walk through alone. The stone, the bench, the careful instructions, all of it had led him back to something that had been his from the start. He placed the whistle to his lips and let out a clear, steady note that carried across the quiet park. It sounded less like a signal and more like a greeting. Nearby, a woman paused her walk, smiling faintly, as if she'd heard something reassuring without knowing why. The younger man lowered the whistle, feeling a quiet warmth spread through his chest. He didn't need the object the way he once had, yet he sensed he would keep it, not as a crutch, but as a symbol of a path retraced. The world around him felt neither overwhelming nor fragile, just present in its ordinary detail. For the first time in a long while, being present felt like enough. He sat there until the sun climbed higher, the morning unfolding without urgency. Somewhere between one breath and the next, he understood that returning to oneself wasn't a single moment, but a gentle, ongoing reunion. Calm wasn't a distant destination. It was a home he could step into whenever he remembered the way. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to rest inside that quiet presence. And when he opened them again, the day felt ready, as if waiting to be lived rather than endured.